and I'm Dahlia Lithwick, and I'm incredibly happy to have you all join me today. So I cover the courts and the law for Slate, and this is a continuation of this new COVID online series from Slate. It's called Q-Tip Mondays, and we're looking at ways to kind of calm and sane and hopeful. And so I'm talking to my guru of hope, Rebecca Solnit, on how to find hope in trying times and how to keep it. And I don't think Rebecca needs a huge introduction from me, but I'll give it anyway. She's a writer, a historian, sort of poetic reviewer of life. She's an activist. She's the author of 20 books on feminism and Western and Indigenous history, popular power, social change, insurrection, wandering, walking, hope, disaster, and her most recent book, which the book tour was cut short by the current crisis, is Reflections of My Non-Existence, which is gorgeous. So Rebecca, welcome.
Lovely to be with you anytime, Dahlia.
So I think I just want to start by asking you personally, Rebecca Solnit, what you've learned about yourself in the last 5-6 weeks. I know you're an outside creature. I don't think of you as somebody who does well inside.
I am both. I am an introspective person who's one of those writers living alone who's been able to joke that my life has not changed very much because of this. And my heart goes out to those who do, whether they're overcrowded and overpressured or lonely and stranded. But I'm leading pretty much the life I have before. We can't go out in San Francisco. There are plenty of uncrowded places. And in some ways, I don't feel very changed. I have been fascinated by the social dynamics around disasters, and there are some remarkable and amazing ones to study right now. Particularly the mask-making economy has been beautiful, inspiring, profound in this moment, looking at all the freelance, ad hoc, volunteer mask-making groups, particularly a group called the Anti-Sewing Squad out of LA with more than 500 women, mostly Asian and Latina, I think, making masks as a kind of guerrilla commando angel team. So I'm kind of doing what I usually do, only, I have this urgent subject in my face like everyone else does, and I'm trying to take care of the people who are having a harder time around me.
It's funny because I sort of remember having a conversation with you maybe 6 months ago when you visited New York and I saw you, and we talked about how Etsy and crafting, a lot of kind of women's crafting is actually political activity. And it doesn't get recognized as that. And I love that you started with masks.
Yeah, because of institutional failure, the masks that frontline workers and everybody else needed did not exist, were not available. And people stepped into the breach, in my experience, almost entirely women, although there is nothing gendered about sewing inherently. And on the one hand, it is more of the burden falling on women in particular, as all the domestic stuff has too, and a lot of the sort of frontline work around caregiving and stuff. On the other hand, this kind of guerrilla rising to meet the need, the altruism, the generosity, the creativity of it is just staggering. And there's so many different ways it's been taking place. We usually think of mutual aid as a strictly outside the financial system, local transaction, but I'm looking at all different models of mask making, including selling them to raise money for groups, people who really need money being given mask making opportunities to support themselves while making masks for other constituencies who need them, like the Amish making masks for the Cleveland Clinic, the New York Times wrote up. But mostly I'm seeing volunteer donations, and I have fallen madly in love with the Anti-Sewing Squad, founded by performance artist Christine Wong, with those 500 plus seamstresses with their kind of witty, hard-boiled, film noir style banter about what they're doing. But mass production to meet the needs of people in the Navajo Nation and other Native nations that are really impacted, homeless people, people just being released from ICE detention and prison, undocumented workers, farm workers, medical workers, public servants and stuff. And just the energy, the passion, the dedication, these women who've been sewing all day, every day for, 6 weeks, is just heroic. And so there's a lot of lousy stuff going on. There's a lot of selfishness and opportunism and fear and rumor spreading and anti-vaxxer dipshits. And, to say nothing of the current administration. But there is this other strain of human nature. It's not the only form of human nature, but I think it is not necessarily the most powerful one at any time, but it's a huge one right now. And I'm seeing it in so many other ways too that I could talk about for hours, but I should let you ask me a question every now and again. So we have this interview format.
I want to talk about your book because you were just launching your book tour. And I want to talk about your recollections of your non-existence for a minute because I think you are just, and I love that you're again talking about masks because I think there's a way in which your book and at least sort of thinking about your early life as a sort of writer struggling to become sort of the writer you are, is such a dance of wanting to be in the world and not be in the world, wanting to be seen and not be seen, wanting to sort of be acknowledged and being really afraid of being seen. And that sort of double life, I guess I'm being too poetic here, but I love that you started with masks because it's so profound. And so I wonder if you can talk a little about what it is that you are writing for younger women who are really, I think, particularly now I'm watching, I have 2 teenage sons. The girls in his class, both of them, are having such a complicated relationship with Zoom classes, Rebecca. They sort of want to be in it. They don't want to be in it. They want to be seen. They don't want to be seen. Can you just talk a little bit about, have we come as far as we needed to come from when you were 19?
We have both come an incredibly long way, not to sound like the old Virginia Slims commercials most people don't remember, but they were in the 70s, they were in Ms. Magazine, and they said, "You've come a long way, baby." We've come a really long way, and we have a really long way to go. And that's kind of how I talk about a lot of stuff, because a lot of people are, they'll say either we've arrived at the destination or we haven't made any progress, we haven't moved at all. And there's a lot of middle space where you can celebrate what's been accomplished. I think the last 7 years have been extraordinary for feminism, the most exciting feminist years and engagement of my life, addressing what I've been most focused on, which is violence against women and all the levels of inequality from the domestic sphere to public space to the workspace that impacts. So, but something I always like to bring up is that patriarchy is an institution that's several thousand years old, and it's encoded in the book of Genesis and many other cultures around the world. The fact that we haven't completely fixed it in the last 50 or so years of feminism is not a sign of defeat. It's a sign of a really good start. And there was a wonderful performance and installation artist in the 70s, Mary Beth Edelson, who made a great installation called "Your 5,000 Years Are Up," mocking all the revolutionary rhetoric of "Your 40 years are up." And of course, they're not up. Patriarchy is in the White House, white supremacist, monstrous, festering patriarchy. And it is, it has not gone away. But just the fact we've named it, we're talking about it, that women and feminists, not all of whom are women, are making decisions in the courtrooms, in how stories are covered, in the media, in who gets selected, that we're asking questions like, is this panel all white? Is this panel all male? That weren't even being asked in, educational circles. We've moved. I find all this encouraging. A word my friend Michael Sims, the writer, reminds me means to instill courage. And it's a sign that we need to keep going and not stop. Not that we can rest on our laurels because it's all so fucking awesome now.
So I want to talk about purpose.
Yeah.
You've written so eloquently about it. Rebecca's got a gorgeous piece in The Guardian almost a month ago now about sort of locating purpose. And I I'm fixated on the word, Rebecca. I guess I can confess that I last week messaged you that I was just faltering. And I think one of the things that's very hard is I'm very good at cooking beans. I'm very good at, food photography when I make like a really good shepherd's pie. Like I know how to do the maintenance, but
Yeah.
purpose is super hard. And as you wrote in The Guardian, if you're not an essential worker, if you're not a janitor and a nurse's aide and working in a home for the elderly, it's really hard to locate your purpose. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about it, because you see crisis as an opportunity for all of us to get better at a little less shopping and a little less money and a little more purpose. And I confess one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is, boy, like the purpose fairies have not necessarily showed up at my door yet.
I think what you might be talking about is the kind of moral fatigue, moral injury of living in a time when suffering and danger and death have suddenly gotten so much worse. I also feel like the first month, particularly of the pandemic, and I addressed that in that Guardian piece, the first month people were I'm not productive the way I should be. And I think what we were all doing, that was an enormous task of productivity, was shifting our psyches, our understanding of the world and our place in it in a huge and colossal way to meet circumstances we had, most of us, never anticipated. And of course, it's different depending on what your shelter in place experience is, what kind of work you do, whether you're in financial free fall because you're laid off, or you're like you and me, you work at home, or you're forced to risk your life to be a cashier without protection and everything in between. But I think almost everybody was making this huge psychic adjustment, and that was productivity and purposefulness. And then I think for those of us who aren't doing frontline work and who aren't suffering in some of the ways I've been mentioning, the illness itself, the risk, the financial catastrophe, the danger at home, I think a lot of us that our purposefulness might be in understanding this crisis, understanding how it's changing the world, and obviously most immediately in ways that are completely horrific. And my heart goes out to everyone, including you living in New York City, and to all the ways people around the world who are in the center of this are suffering. But, I was doing my homework to get ready for this. I don't know if people can see this, but let's see. BP net profit slide 67% in the first quarter following historic fall in oil prices. A week or so ago, was it Brent crude out of Texas hit negative $41 a barrel, which is just freaky. As you know, I've been a climate activist for a long time. I'm on the board of Oil Change International, an amazing climate group that was made for this moment and is documenting the collapse of the fossil fuel industry. So we have a bigger problem than the pandemic, which is climate change. And in two ways, without denying the suffering, without wishing that this was happening, because I wish that we were all prepared and it wasn't and had been prevented, we have an opportunity to address the climate crisis now in two ways, one of which is the climate movement has been told since its inception that change is impossible. We can't change anything. The status quo is immutable and inevitable and necessary. And now we've seen, suddenly we can pull $3 trillion out of thin air and throw it around like drunkards. Suddenly we can completely stop industries and completely retool things. So the argument has fallen apart, and the fossil fuel industry, particularly the oil sector, because of low demand and because of its own bad decisions and rapacity over decades, is also falling apart in ways that don't mean that we're home safe and we can just glide on in, but do mean that there's an incredible opportunity here to orchestrate the managed decline and essentially save the planet if people get on board. So I'm both devastated and excited about this moment. And I think so much of being a human being who's engaged in any way is knowing that people are being born and people are being died, and people, no, see, I just said that people are being born and people are dying in the same moments, that people are suffering and people are getting married and having birthday parties. People are making face masks and idiots are protesting with guns, that these things coexist. So I feel both right now, and I'm trying to pay as much attention as I can to both and try and understand them.
I had oil underlined and circled, so I'm glad you held up your aid. But I want to ask you, I think what you're saying, Rebecca, and I think you've said this a long time. I mean, since I've been reading you, you said it about Katrina, you've said it, about other natural disasters, that the broken stuff was already broken, a lot of it. And
Yeah.
I think that one of the things you're saying, and I think it's really important, is some of the suffering right now is existential. It is death and fear and people on social media posting every day that someone precious died at 78. Some of the suffering is, holy cow, we incarcerate too many people in this country. Holy cow, we're destroying the planet. Holy cow, people are one paycheck away from bankruptcy, one medical disaster away from all that pre-existed COVID. And it will, I think you're saying, require really engaging with that and not papering it over. And so part of what, maybe I think what you're saying that helps me is realizing that there is a vast, underneath the tip of the iceberg, amount that was already broken that we have to look at hard.
If we didn't have a broken electoral system, we wouldn't have President Trump. If we didn't have a broken healthcare system, there's so many things that were already broken. If we had universal health care, if we had the kinds of aid to people who lost their jobs they have from Spain to Canada, so much of the fact that the US has become the worst hit country by the pandemic, despite the fact that we're wealthy, that we have amazing medical workers, etc., is about not an absolute lack of resources, but an extraordinary and corrupt misdistribution that, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders campaigns were addressing, Occupy Wall Street tried to address, progressives have been addressing for decades, healthcare activists have been addressing. The word crisis is also a medical term for when you reach the turning point where you either get better or are going to die. And I think some of our systems are in crisis and in that sense. And what I hope as we come out of the most intense phase of the crisis is that we're really clear about what failed and what needs to change, and that we don't let go of what we learned. And the worst thing that happens after disasters in a way is that people think they're going to go back to normal. Normal was already broken. Normal was already corrupt. Normal was already destructive. And we want to say that things can actually be better. And things do sometimes change for the better in the wake of disasters because everything has broken loose. Everything is up for grabs. So the grabbing, of course, has already begun as wealthy elites are profiting, big corporations are grabbing unfair shares of aid and etc. But there's room to fight back. And I think you can see with the strikes by workers at companies like Amazon and Whole Foods that there is also a kind of labor unrest that I think is really energized right now in a new way. And I also think something that happens constantly in disaster is a sense of solidarity. You suddenly have something in common with people that you may not have felt before. And there's ways in which privilege lets people check out of we're all in this together, go live in their country home, stay home, have other people do their shopping for them. But there are ways that I think a lot of us value a lot of workers we hadn't paid enough attention to, transit workers, sanitary workers, medical workers, and recognize the systems of survival we're all dependent on, and that may be a foundation for doing more and better solidarity around labor, medical care, around all these social justice issues, and I sure hope so.
So there's a through line from where you started with the masks and now, which is It goes to something you and I also, I feel like we talked about a year ago, and that is we're so hungry for heroes. And one of the ways we got into trouble in this country is somebody said, I alone can fix it. And a lot of us believed that. But even, you and I have gone through the like Bob Mueller, votive candle, and then the, Adam Schiff candle, and then the Ruth Bader. Like, I think that what you're describing, Rebecca, which I think is just really important, is this may not be a situation that Nancy Pelosi alone fixes this. This is happening because Amazon workers and, doctors who are blocking protesters so that folks can get to the ER. I mean, we may never know the names of some of the people who are doing it.
No, the essay I'm proudest of and happiest with from last year's Lit Hub essay called "When the Hero is the Problem," looking at how often we're given narratives of the rugged lone savior, usually male, whose usual superpower is violence. And the reality is violence is not how we accomplish most things. Violence is often a sign of weakness because you failed to build a coalition, negotiate, convince people, etc. And that goes for idiots showing up with guns in, state capitals too. What actually changes the world mostly, most effectively, most importantly, is broad coalitions of unarmed people. And the people who matter in that, who might get lionized, I always think of as catalysts, not leaders. Leaders create followers. Shepherds have sheep, and catalysts instead are people who inspire people, frame the argument, open the door on the possibilities, kind of let people find their own heroic capacity to lead. And for example, there is no leader of the mass. Christine Wong coalesced 500 plus people, but there are tens or hundreds of thousands of people across this country making masks. We can call all of them heroes. Every frontline worker a hero. Everyone who suddenly became a homeschooler against her will and desire a hero. Everyone who's comforting the afflicted, whether it's with uplifting social media messages and really good listening skills, or actually intubating the desperately ill, is a hero. And insofar as even hero is a useful term, and I think almost all our problems are storytelling problems, or at least all our political problems are. And because the media and the entertainment complex love rugged, lone, manly, shovel-jawed, armed to the teeth, 12-pack heroes, they're constantly shifting their focus to those dudes and the solutions those dudes are capable of, which are usually terrible non-solutions that are problems themselves, starting with shooting everybody like Clint Eastwood, who I sometimes think is single-handedly responsible for all the fantasies behind the NRA and the gun cult. And, I was taking a walk, a nice socially distanced walk in my neighborhood, and just looking at tree roots breaking concrete and seeing that something as soft as wood is stronger than concrete. And that water wears away stone, and we need better stories, and that's a long-term problem. And I think that process of changing stories has begun, but change always comes from the margins, the shadows, the outsiders, the people treated as minorities and wackos and irrelevancies, and they gradually arrive at the center. And that process is going on, but we need to kill off some of the pernicious stories at the center. And of course, Nancy Pelosi specifically is only strong if the Democrats are the majority in the House, and then if people organize to support and push their own elected representatives. For better or worse, she's mine. I wish I was across the bay with Barbara Lee instead. And but if we organize to have their backs when they advocate for something good, when we push them to advocate harder for stuff they're not doing enough on, like climate and so forth and so on. So, the power rests with the people when the people get it together to claim their power and know their power. And of course, everything in this culture is geared towards convincing us we're powerless and need rugged shovel-jawed heroes and guns and exceptional people. And so that's, that's something I've dedicated a lot of my writing to. And I think you have too, moving the focus in law from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, superstar, to all these amazing women we were talking about last year who are fighting for civil rights, constitutional rights, human rights all around the country at all levels, as lawyers, as judges, as advocates, as professors. And so how do we decenter focus? Is, how do we go from zooming in on one close-up to the panoramic view is a literary problem as well as a political problem.
I have a question.
3 minutes.
No, I also have a bunch of viewer questions, and I want to get to one that I think pulls together some of the stuff you just said, with the huge caveat that, I needed a manicure and I didn't know it till right now, but the huge caveat, Rebecca, that we've all been saying for 3 years, why are we not out on the streets? We should be out on the streets. What would it take to get on the streets? And now we actually can't be on the streets, but all the organizing you're describing is happening nonetheless. And I just think that's also just a seismic shift. But I have a question that I think is a storytelling question from Frida, who says, direct care workers are still not getting adequate PPE. They're still overlooked. How do we turn it around? That's also a storytelling problem, right? I mean, that is the telling the story of the Michigan Capitol siege instead of this.
Yeah, and I hate how attention-getting that stuff is when those people represent a tiny minority and most people respect and, go along with the shelter-in-place social distance orders, wear a mask in proximity orders, etc. And I think the focus has been on hospitals, which are having their own crises as all the stuff they make their money from falls away. But we have been focused on getting PPE to them. But there have been really good journalistic stories about how much of this pandemic has been people in nursing homes because they're ideal for contagion and they're full of people who are already severely compromised medically. I think, again, it's going to be partly about storytelling. We need to make it intolerable that these people don't have what they need. Most human rights struggles have proceeded partly as storytelling, making Jim Crow segregation intolerable by showing the violence that happens when you try and order a grilled cheese sandwich at a lunch counter in the South if you're Black, by showing what apartheid looks like by building shanty towns on your campus in the 80s, by showing what sweatshops look like in the 90s, by showing what clear cuts look like. And so, yeah, we need to make that more urgently visible and more unacceptable. And that's one of the many ways in which storytelling is a power. And thank you for it, Frida, because I will try and amplify that more myself. I have been paying attention to it. I've been hearing from a supportive care home nurse. I know hospice nurses and hospice chaplains, and you're right.
I have one more quick question, Rebecca, if you'll indulge me, and this is from Marie, and she just wants to know, what is it going to actually look like? It feels like wishful thinking to say economic change, gender change, race, racial justice, equality, that all that shifts. But you've seen it shift. You've chronicled it shifting. Tell us what it looks like.
One of the pleasures of being old, which I think I'll take on that mantle at this point, is having seen huge shifts in my lifetime. And I was born before the first public gay elected representative. I was born when 4 women in the Senate was considered some kind of feminist sweep.
Right.
And, and then I'll fall back on my favorite line from Terminator 2, the future is not yet written. So it's up to us to write it. And we're in a free-for-all. The disaster does not magically produce and hand us nice things. It sheds light on injustice. It destabilizes the status quo. The people who benefited from the status quo, from inequality and exploitation, are already seeking more, whether it's saying meat packers must die so that America can have its pork chops, or the rest. But there's also, so we're going to enter an epic struggle over what happened and why and what needs to change in response around healthcare, around the fact that a huge percentage of the nation has lost employment and is in financial freefall. We are no longer going to have a coherent, we've always assumed you buy things with wages, everyone can get a job. That was already falling apart. A lot of full-time minimum wage people couldn't afford housing, food, and the rest. A lot of people, even doing better, couldn't afford medical care. We're going to have to decouple essential needs from wage labor. And so essentially, we've already needed a revolution. The case is stronger. The suffering is stronger. We have our work cut out for us. And let's hope that people remember, let's hope we tell the stories that we can change the country, the world, the conditions, that we can meet the needs of the most oppressed and suffering, and that the work is not anybody else's responsibility. Anyone can be a hero, and all of us have a role in this.
So 2 things, folks. Rebecca Solnit's new book, Recollections of My Non-Existence, published by Viking. You'd be doing all writers a huge favor if you support them now, particularly folks who had no book tour to promote their books. And I assure you, as with all of Rebecca's books, it is worth your time. 2, I want to thank Rebecca because years ago when my older son was struggling with middle school climate meltdown and he was getting really stressed out, Rebecca's Hope in the Darkness really helped him, and I've been calling her my rabbi, only half jokingly, ever since. So thank you, Rebecca Solnit. To all the folks who are watching, come back next Monday. Brian Lauder is going to be making cocktails for you. Rebecca, thank you for your time and your huge heart and your mind. Take good care.
Love you, Dahlia. Thank you, everyone who is listening. Talk to you soon.